Hi, everybody. I have Drew here from Abby with me today to talk about process intelligence. So, before we dive into my questions for you, Drew, would you give an introduction of yourself?
Sure. So again, my name is Drew Reynolds. I'm a senior business development manager with Abby, and on the process intelligence side, I've been in process automation and discovery for about the last 20 years or so, working with everything from capture to BPM, intelligent automation, RPA, and now process discovery and intelligence.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, today we're going to talk about that idea of process intelligence and kind of how it pertains to a lot of what you just talked about, whether that's BPM or RPA. So, I want to get us started with the conversation of RPA and how, what makes those implementations kind of tricky because as kind of cut and dry as it may seem on the surface, a lot of times we see that there is a little bit of disjointedness in the success of those projects. So can you talk a little bit about what makes that difficult?
Sure. So I'm sure you've seen, Emma, as I have, all the failure rates of these projects put out by the major consulting firms. The numbers I see are about 40 to 60% of these projects fail to meet their goals. And one of the main reasons for that is that these projects are being undertaken without a complete or accurate understanding of how the as-is process is actually being executed and what the issues are. So what that does is it leaves these organizations to try to apply automation in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is, without detailed and accurate process knowledge, we see organizations do things such as automate broken processes or just do the wrong things faster, or attempt to automate non-standard processes. If there's a lot of variability and things don't go down the same path, it becomes extremely complex to try to apply automation to take into account all the different ways things could go. Another thing they do is they effectively automate a task or a sub-process, but because they don't have that end-to-end process knowledge of what goes on both sides of that, they can actually automate something, a very successful project where they increase the speed of a task or a sub-process by 2 to 3 times. But if that isn't on the critical path, your overall process metric has not changed. You haven't moved anything. It still takes you the same amount of time. Now you're just doing something that's not on the critical path a bit faster, or you may have just moved a bottleneck down the road to the next department, the next system. So again, you might even have a negative effect if that bottleneck becomes more expensive to deal with down the road. And then finally, one more point would be, we see a lot of times companies just using automation to address issues when if you really dug down into the root cause, they would be better remedied by other means, such as possibly process redesign or process standardization or employee training. So RPA is a great tool, but it needs to be used at the right point for the right reasons.
Yeah, that idea of really focusing in on that process first and then trying to figure out what tools and how to automate later on in the process makes a lot of sense to me. So, kind of going off of that doom and gloom message a little bit of 40% of RPA projects not being successful, how does process intelligence or process discovery, like we're talking about today, help combat those challenges?
Sure. So with process intelligence, you're using data to reconstruct that end-to-end business process across multiple systems within the organization. So you get that full process view. The other thing that's really helpful about it is it's an objective view of what's happening, and it's an accurate view. So in the manual methods where you do interviews, you put post-it notes up on walls to try to check. There's a lot of bias, intentional or unintentional, that goes into that. There's a lot of things people don't know, and you get rid of all that when you just look at the data and start to use those data-driven insights as opposed to those other methods. The other thing is, because we're using analytical tools and data, you're able to see a lot more. You're able to see all the variation that occurs within that process, every different process instance. So it's going to be a lot more granular than the other ways that people have done this in the past. And then again, within process intelligence, you have analytical tools that you can now apply to that data model to identify things such as, where are my bottlenecks? Where are my high cost tasks and sub processes? Or where are my non-compliant behaviors where I'm increasing my risk? So now you can have a much quicker discovery process because obviously taking in data and applying algorithms to it is much faster than the manual way. You're able to understand and quantify what that as-is process is, and then identify targets for automation and RPA that are going to provide the best return and accelerate those projects. So once you dig further into the data, you're going to avoid all those pitfalls we just talked about. You're going to automate the right things with the right technologies and take on the high impact opportunities that are going to avoid those project failure rates that we talked about earlier.
Perfect. So there's a couple of other things that you sprinkled in there in terms of ideas or challenges that process intelligence can help solve. So I want to play a little bit of a game with you where I'm going to give you a couple more challenges or pain points that businesses face, and then have you kind of rapid fire go into just a little bit more detail about maybe how we can help address those issues. So the first one that I heard you mention is this idea of compliance. So can you talk a little bit more about how process discovery or that intelligence can support compliance efforts?
Absolutely. So once we have the data in the system, we reconstruct every single process instance that occurred. So I'll give you an example. We have one of the largest financial services companies in North America, and they were trying to audit their onboarding process to ensure it was compliant. They had 16 people that were able to audit about 15% of the transactions. Now with the data structure that we can provide in timeline and with process intelligence, you have every single process instance document. So now you can instantly go back and ask a question of the data. Have we ever put somebody in an investment without having sent them a prospectus? And you will be able to get immediately returned every process instance where that happened. So that group was able to go down to 3 people from 16. It saved them about $2 million in FTEs, but they didn't even care about that. They were just wanting to find $10 million, $100 million for being non-compliant. So very powerful in terms of being able to audit and ensure that you're hitting all your compliance guidelines and regulations.
Perfect. So my next area is going to be workforce optimization. How can we help address those concerns?
Yeah, so with the analytical tools we talked about, again, it's very useful for RPA, but we're looking at the process. So we're looking at how people are performing, how groups are performing, how individuals are performing. So you may have an issue that comes down to the fact that, okay, this process is taking longer because it's being done in the Western region and they're doing it 3 times as slow. So instead of trying to automate something to fix it, it may be that that region may need retraining. You may find a group that's doing something 2 times faster and they found a new way to do a task or a process, but they haven't express that to the rest of the enterprise. So now you've uncovered a best practice that you can then use and replicate across the organization. So being able to evaluate how people are working, what they're doing, how efficient they are, you're able to use those workforce optimization strategies as opposed to just trying to, again, apply automation where it may not be the best fit.
Perfect. And we've got about a minute left. So this one's going to have to be kind of dovetailing off of that last one, but kind of going off of that standardization of processes. Can you share a little bit more about that one with us?
Sure. So many times when people see the many variations that the process goes down, I mentioned that, if your process executes in a different way every time, before you automate it, it makes a lot of sense to standardize a lot of it so that, again, you don't have that complexity. So being able to standardize a process and then more effectively apply automation to it is a very effective technique.
Woohoo, you came in just on the clock. So thank you so much for joining me, Drew. I am going to link to a webinar that I've got coming up next week where I'm going to talk just a little bit about this in the post as well. But please feel free to reach out to myself or Drew if you've got any further questions about process discovery. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.